Want to reach out and they want you, the listener, to dig this, to get this, to feel it the way they're feeling it. That's what their intention is. Their intention isn't to say, I'm great, look at me. Yeah. Their intention is...
There's a truth you never knew about Paul Rodgers. He's hailed as one of rock's greatest voices, the man who led Free, Bad Company, and even Queen. But behind the glory lies a darker truth. There were famous bands he despised, not rivals, not simple disagreements. To Rodgers, they were traitors who sold out rock itself, and now, at 75, he's finally naming them. The truth is more shocking than anyone expected. Fleetwood Mac. Of all the bands Rodgers clashed with, none provoked his fury quite like them. This wasn't casual dislike. It was a deep wound, a grudge he carried for decades. It started with admiration. In the late 1960s, Fleetwood Mac were torchbearers of British blues, founded by Peter Green, a guitarist Rodgers respected deeply. Back then, he saw them as allies in preserving the emotional grit of rock. But by the mid-1970s, that admiration curdled. With Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, the band left their raw blues roots behind for a glossy California pop sound. When Rumors exploded in 1977, selling over 40 million copies, most called it genius. Rodgers saw it as betrayal. What enraged him wasn't just the polished sound or a chart success. It was how the band erased their blues heritage. He began calling them out privately, labeling their new music the death of the blues dressed up as pop gold. At a 1977 industry gala, he reportedly turned his back when Fleetwood Mac was introduced, spitting that their music had become cocktail party wallpaper. To him, they'd sold their soul, betrayed their legacy, and mocked it by calling the betrayal evolution. By the early 80s, Rodgers' hostility became impossible to ignore. He avoided the band completely. When asked to play a high-profile charity festival featuring Fleetwood Mac, he declined without hesitation, saying he'd never share a stage with a band that buried the blues for money. His anger only grew with age. He believed Fleetwood Mac weren't artists anymore. They were deserters. The band never responded. Mick Fleetwood defended their evolution as a natural step. That silence only deepened Rodgers' fury. He wasn't against change. He'd evolved too. But he believed they crossed a moral line, choosing pop stardom over cultural roots. For him, that was unforgivable. Even in recent interviews, he still speaks of Fleetwood Mac with contempt, calling their hits polished lies and the death of British blues on a world stage. The wound never healed. They weren't just a band he disliked. They were a symbol of when rock stopped being dangerous and started being a product. Then came Chicago. If Fleetwood Mac represented betrayal, Chicago represented tragedy. Rodgers didn't just dislike what they became, he mourned it. In the late 60s and early 70s, Chicago fused rock with jazz and horns, daring to stretch the genre. Rodgers admired them. They were bold, intelligent, and soulful. Then, in his view, they threw it all away. By the late 70s, Chicago ditched their ambitious sound for syrupy ballads. Songs like If You Leave Me Now and Hard to Say I'm Sorry became huge hits. But to Rodgers, they were proof of artistic suicide. Former producer James William Guercio remembered Rodgers' heartbreak. They had lightning in a bottle and poured it down the drain. To Rodgers, they went from pioneers to a Vegas lounge act. He refused to perform alongside them, even declining a jazz rock festival appearance because they were on the bill. His bitterness only intensified. Chicago, once daring, had become a warning. Even innovators could lose their courage. The band stayed silent. But that silence infuriated him more. They were making millions, satisfied with commercial success, while abandoning the spirit that once made them revolutionary. Rodgers often spoke of Chicago with real pain, calling their transformation a funeral for ambition. He still names them second only to Fleetwood Mac as the most unforgivable band in his eyes. Then there was REO Speedwagon. Rodgers never forgot the night he saw Kevin Cronin singing "Keep on Lovin' You" to an arena full of swaying fans. To Rodgers, it wasn't rock. It was sentimental theater. He muttered, "This isn't rock. It's wallpaper." That moment sealed REO's place on his blacklist. Early on, he had tolerated REO as a gritty Midwestern band, with Gary Richrath's guitar giving them some hard rock credibility. Albums like Ridden the Storm Out had some bite. But the 1980s changed that. REO leaned into polished ballads and exploded in popularity. High Infidelity sold over 10 million copies. Songs like "Can't Fight This Feeling" and "Keep on Lovin' You" dominated charts. That success made Rodgers furious. It wasn't just that they changed, it was that their soft ballads became the face of American rock. He called it betrayal. Former Epic Records exec Ron Alexenberg recalled Rodgers' disgust. "They've turned American rock into background music for people who don't actually like rock." At a European festival in 1983, Rodgers watched foreign crowds sing REO's hits like they were gospel. To him, it was humiliating. He refused to share stages, declined panels celebrating the band, and called them a warning to younger artists. REO, for their part, shrugged off the criticism. Kevin Cronin said their ballads came from the heart. Rodgers dismissed it as pandering. To him, they were no longer a band. They were a stain on rock's reputation. Asia was another source of deep disappointment. On paper, they were a supergroup. Steve Howe, John Wetton, Carl Palmer, Jeff Downes, legends of Yes, King Crimson, and ELP. Rodgers respected them all until they released their debut in 1982. Instead of visionary prog, he heard what he called lowest common denominator rock. The album was a commercial triumph, but to Rodgers, it was genius settling for mediocrity. Former Geffen exec John Kalodner remembered Rodgers comparing it to Picasso painting house numbers. That was the depth of his disappointment. Asia's success encouraged other seasoned artists to chase formulas over innovation, and Rodgers saw it as a virus spreading through rock. At an industry event in 1983, when asked about Asia, he quipped, "If wisdom leads to compromise, maybe we're better off staying naive and hungry." Asia, of course, defended their choices. Wetton said they wanted to connect with people. Rodgers scoffed. Melody without risk to him wasn't art, it was cowardice. Asia symbolized wasted genius. They weren't just another soft rock act. They were the fall from grace he could never forgive. Then came Foreigner. When Paul Rodgers first heard Lou Gramm on the radio, he froze, not in awe, but in anger. He heard slick, calculated anthems engineered for American airwaves, not soul, not grit, just compromise. Rodgers didn't hate Mick Jones for lacking talent. He hated him for abandoning British rock roots to chase U.S. success. He called it cultural treason, accusing Jones of turning British blues into export-friendly product. Foreigner's massive success only made things worse. Songs like Cold as Ice, Urgent, and Waiting for a Girl Like You became FM staples. Rodgers saw them as hollow victories, music tailored for sales, not expression. At a 1981 industry event in London, he refused to engage with Foreigner reps, saying, I won't shake hands with people who've sold their musical passport for a bigger bank account. He saw Foreigner not only betraying heritage, but encouraging others to follow. They didn't just compromise, they changed the landscape. And Rodgers never forgave that. To him, they weren't a band. They were a case study in how British rock became American business. Finally, Journey. Rodgers first heard Don't Stop Believin' backstage at a U.S. festival in the early '80s. The crowd roared. He winced. To him, it wasn't uplifting. It was rock turned into a jukebox. Before Steve Perry, Journey were daring. They flirted with jazz rock, took musical risks. Rodgers respected that. But when Columbia pushed them toward ballad-driven radio rock, he saw it as the ultimate sellout. Albums like Escape were massive. Songs like Open Arms and Faithfully became anthems. But to Rodgers, they were lifeless, safe, engineered. He described Journey's shift as the death of artistic courage. Columbia Records president Walter Yetnikoff recalled Rodgers's blunt verdict. They traded their compass for a calculator. He refused to join a panel on career reinvention because Journey was being honored. He wouldn't celebrate what he saw as surrender. To him, Journey weren't just another soft rock band. They were the sound of rebellion dying. Steve Perry defended the band, saying their ballads were heartfelt. Rodgers scoffed. Real emotion meant grit, struggle, imperfection, not polished radio ballads tailored for mass appeal. Even now, Rodgers sees Journey as a turning point. The moment risk vanished from rock, and comfort took over. And there it is. The bands Paul Rodgers could never forgive. To him, they weren't just different styles. They were betrayals. Each one, in their own way, marked the moment when rock stopped being dangerous and became a product. But what about you? Was he right? Or was he just unwilling to evolve? Rodgers never saw rock as a sound. It was a spirit. For him, it was rebellion, rawness, truth. Not perfection, not polish, and certainly not algorithms and chart formulas. The moment he sensed that a band was writing music based on what would work rather than what needed to be said, they lost him forever. That's why he remained loyal to artists like Peter Green or Steve Marriott, even if their careers burned out early. To Rodgers, it was better to go down swinging than to win by giving up the fight. His critics say he was just bitter, an aging purist unable to accept that the world had changed, that genres evolve, tastes shift, and fans grow up. They argue that Journey's ballads, Foreigner's anthems, and Fleetwood Mac's reinvention weren't betrayals. They were smart, heartfelt, and legitimate expressions that spoke to millions. After all, what's wrong with success? What's so unforgivable about music that connects with people, even if it's softer, safer, or less revolutionary? But to Rodgers, that was exactly the problem. Connection, he believed, shouldn't come at the cost of honesty. Music wasn't supposed to be engineered like a product or packaged like a brand. He feared that as more bands prioritized radio-friendly melodies and chart-safe lyrics, the soul of rock would be diluted beyond recognition. In his mind, the industry didn't just reward compromise, it demanded it. And the bands he condemned were the ones who gave in, not because they had to, but because it was easier. Even as the decades rolled on, Rodgers stuck to this belief like doctrine. While others mellowed, he sharpened. He didn't crave nostalgia either. He didn't long for the good old days of rock as a cheap memory trip. He longed for its danger, its risk, its power to shake the room, not charm it. For Rodgers, rock wasn't a soundtrack to life. It was life, or at least the part of it that refused to be quiet, polite, or profitable. Some have called him elitist. Others have praised his integrity. But no matter how he's remembered, Paul Rodgers never wavered. He didn't want to be adored. He wanted to be understood. That's why, even now in interviews, he avoids the usual soft-spoken nostalgia and instead speaks like a man still in the middle of a fight. Because, in his eyes, the fight for authenticity in music never ended. It just became harder to see. And maybe that's the real tragedy in Rodgers' story. Not the grudges, not the rivalries, not the names crossed off his mental list. It's the sense that somewhere along the line, the world moved on from what he believed rock was supposed to be. The industry changed. Audiences changed. The fire that once needed only a guitar and a truth to set a room ablaze was now buried under auto-tune, marketing metrics, and good vibes. To some, Paul Rodgers is a relic, a voice from a bygone era yelling at clouds. But to others, he's a sentinel, a keeper of a flame that so many let die. He may not have always been right. He may have been harsh, unforgiving, even unfair, but he never stopped believing that rock should matter, that it should bruise, challenge, and break things, not wrap them in ribbons and sell them back to the masses. So the question isn't just whether Rodgers was right. The question is, do we still want music that risks being hated just to say something real? Or have we settled for playlists that never make us feel too much, offend too loudly, or dare to fail? You don't have to agree with Paul Rodgers, but you can't ignore the fact that what he stood for is disappearing, and once it's gone, who will fight to bring it back?